When a customer clicks a button to request a ride on Uber, very few know about the dark history that allowed the world-famous ride-sharing company to reach its status. The story of Uber is about more than just an app. It's about corporate greed, yacht parties, cocaine, stealing private information, and even tricking the government and Apple. Today, we'll tell you the story of Uber that nobody else will. Welcome to the Lightning Rod channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos. Uber was founded in 2009 by Garrett Camp and Travis Kalanick. The two entrepreneurs had the idea to create a smartphone app that would allow users to request a private taxi cab driver at the push of a button. The app would then use GPS to connect the user with the nearest available driver who was also signed up for the app. The company launched its first service, Uber Cab, in San Francisco back in 2010. The service allowed users to request a black car with a professional driver. The fare was calculated based on the time and distance of the trip, but unlike a normal taxi ride, the user would know their cost up front, and the driver would also know the expected payout. By launching a small pilot program in a single city, Kalanick and Cam quickly figured out that they had struck gold. They knew that the magic in a bottle that was Uber was not going to be just the next big tech company, but the next big unicorn, a tech startup valued at $1 billion or more. As the founders expected, the service was an instant hit, and Uber quickly tried to begin expanding to other cities, but before long, they started encountering major problems. When San Francisco realized how big Uber was becoming, they quickly became sour with the new company. You see, Uber was actually challenging one of San Francisco's biggest moneymakers. For years, the city maintained a pool of taxi medallions, and in order to own and operate a taxi cab, a driver would need to own one of these medallions. The demand for this limited pool of medallions was astronomical, driving their prices up to hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. Uber had unwittingly used their app to create a loophole around the medallion system, meaning that taxi drivers no longer had to own a medallion in order to provide their services. San Francisco protested, but Uber protested even harder. Despite warnings to cease and desist, Uber maintained in providing services in San Francisco, continuing to let the general public use their app. San Francisco's mayor at the time, Ed Lee, started setting up frequent meetings with Uber executives in order to try to get rid of the service. In response, Uber executives started to become increasingly rebellious, frequently making fun of the establishment behind its back. Uber tossed the mayor's warnings in the trash and continued to operate. Finally, San Francisco had had enough. Rather than continuing to give warnings to Uber, the mayor's office began a scorched earth campaign to scare the drivers themselves away from working with Uber. The idea was simple. A regulator working on behalf of the city would hail a ride through the app, and upon being dropped off by a driver, they would write outsized tickets to the cab drivers and then would threaten them with vehicle impoundment and arrest. Drivers started to become fearful, but Uber would not back down. But rather than trying to work with the city, Uber picked up its own spears in a decision that would initiate Uber's descent into becoming one of the most scandal-ridden companies on the planet. Greedball. Without explanation, the regulators deployed by San Francisco to curb Uber from operating just stopped getting Uber rides altogether. To them, it was as if the app didn't really exist. No matter what they tried, they simply couldn't get a ride anywhere. If the app did display drivers, they would be plagued with ridiculous wait times, multiple driver switches, and other problems until they simply stopped trying. It seemed as if a force from above simply prevented regulators from getting a ride. But behind the backs of regulators, Uber was doing something crazy. Without the knowledge of its customers, Uber was tracking which customers it thought were regulators based on the details used to sign up for the app, as well as the behavior and location of customers. Then, using the profiles which they pieced together, Uber would target the presumed regulators by serving them a substitute, nearly unusable version of the app. Godview technology. Greedball was just one example of a much bigger problem, Godview. Uber's Godview technology was a module which allowed Uber to track the location of customers without their consent, even after they had deleted the Uber app. The discovery of Greedball came alongside a suite of other instances which many others refer to as creepy stalker view technology. In fact, It's well known that a senior manager hacked into the account of a visiting journalist in order to follow her movements. Alarm bells are raised at Apple. While Uber's charade of tracking users' phones went on for a while, it was eventually discovered in their app source code, which they were publishing to the Apple App Store. As a result, Uber quickly came to the desk of Apple CEO Tim Cook. Tim Cook called up Travis Kalanick and said that in order to remain on the App Store, Uber would have to start complying with Apple's terms of service. Kalanick conceded this and offered to Tim Cook to remove the module. But behind Apple's back, Uber did something even crazier. Rather than revoke Godview entirely, they programmed their source code to include two separate versions. One version was deployed to the general public, but that wasn't the version available to Apple employees. By geofencing Apple's headquarters, Uber was able to deploy a different version of the app specifically to App Store engineers who were reviewing the app in Apple's headquarters in Cupertino. Therefore, while Apple thought that Uber was complying, they in fact were lying directly to their faces. Eventually, an engineer who was working from home caught on and quickly brought the issue back to Tim Cook, who then booked a very uncomfortable meeting with Uber executives, including Kalanick, and forced them to fix the version of the app that was being deployed onto the App Store. Booking fake rides. Besides scandals involving scamming regulators, tricking Apple, and tracking customers, Uber also has had issues with its competitors. In 2014, Uber drivers, staff, and management were caught using alternative ride-hailing applications such as Lyft to pre-book journeys only to cancel them at the last minute. This strategy would result in drivers using Uber instead, citing that they would get less frequent cancellations. However, Uber eventually labeled the practice as too aggressive in retrospect. Partying, gambling, and drug use at the work event. Some of the scandals and controversies that led to Kalanick's resignation as CEO of Uber centered on the belief that Kalanick had established a workplace culture that accepted and even encouraged inappropriate behavior such as excessive drinking and sexual harassment. Workers joked about using business credit cards to pay for visits to strip clubs, and CEO Travis Kalanick wrote an email outlining guidelines for sexual activity at an off-site work retreat. In the wake of an investigation conducted by the law firm Covington & Burling in June 2017, company officials were advised to prohibit drug usage and restrict alcohol consumption at company-sponsored gatherings. An investigation was also launched after the New York Times published a story about an Uber company event in Las Vegas that reportedly featured heavy drinking, gambling, and cocaine usage. Employment status of drivers. Besides Uber's many private scandals, most of the company's public-facing problems have been with drivers. You see, Uber is able to make so much money because its drivers, unlike other cab companies, are not employees, but rather are called independent contractors. This means that Uber doesn't have to afford luxuries for their drivers, such as overtime hours, health benefits, and retirement plans. One of Uber's biggest fights to date was over something called Prop 22. Prop 22 is a law that was passed in California in 2020 that allows Uber and Lyft drivers to remain independent contractors. This was a huge win for Uber and Lyft as it allowed them to continue to operate as they had been, and it also meant that they didn't have to provide their drivers with the same benefits that employees received. However, Prop 22 was heavily challenged, and it's possible that it could be overturned. If that happens, it would be a huge blow to Uber and Lyft, as they would likely have to reclassify their drivers as employees. This would be a huge expense for the companies, and it would also mean that they would have to provide their drivers with benefits like health insurance and paid time off. This isn't just a problem for Uber in the United States. A group of Uber drivers in New Zealand won a historic case against the ride-hailing business. The ruling requires Uber to recognize the drivers as employees rather than independent contractors. Even while the New Zealand Employment Court's judgment only affects the 4 drivers involved in the class action case filed in July, the verdict may have broader consequences for drivers throughout the country who are seeking to qualify for worker rights and benefits. This development in New Zealand occurs immediately after the United States Department of Labor proposed major modifications to the classification of gig workers. More specifically, the proposed judgment would make gig workers employees if they're financially dependent on the organization for which they work. Charges of sexual harassment. However, we haven't even covered the most sinister Uber scandals as of yet, so be sure to stick through until the end of the video. Susan Fowler, a former Uber engineer, wrote an article on her experience there and released it in February 2017. In it, she detailed how her manager had propositioned her for sex and how the company had failed to take action when she reported it. The article sparked a wave of outrage and led to an investigation into the company's workplace culture. In June 2017, Uber hired former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder to investigate the allegations. Holder's report, which was released in July, found that Uber's workplace culture was in need of critical attention and work. The report made 47 recommendations, including changes to the company's human resources practices and increasing diversity and inclusion. In August, Uber's board of directors voted to adopt all of the recommendations. Following this in September, Uber hired its first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Bo-Young Lee. Lee's appointment was widely seen as a positive step for the company. However, in December, Lee resigned from her role, citing personal reasons. In January 2018, Uber hired its second Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Bernard Coleman. However, in May, Coleman also resigned from his role, citing personal reasons. Finally, in June, Uber hired its third Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Tony West. West is a former U.S. attorney and a partner at the law firm of Munger, Tolles & Olson. Then, in July, Uber released its first diversity report. The report showed that Uber's workplace is still predominantly male and white. However, the report also showed that Uber is making progress on its diversity goals. A poisonous work environment and company culture were among the issues raised. Uber eventually had to fire many employees due to the allegations, including business development lead Emil Michael. Delayed disclosure of data breaches, driver information. Uber disclosed the hack that occurred earlier on February 27, 2015. About 50 drivers' names and license plates were accidentally made public. Uber found out about the breach in September 2014, but it took them almost 5 months to contact those who were impacted. According to a statement released in November 2017, a separate data breach in 2016 exposed the personal details of 600,000 drivers and 57 million users. Information such as names, addresses, phone numbers, and driver's license numbers were stored here. The hackers broke into a secret GitHub repository used by Uber's developers by using the identities and passwords of employees whose accounts had been hacked in prior hacks, otherwise known as credential stuffing. When hackers demanded $100,000 from Uber, the company paid up so long as the hackers promised to destroy the stolen information. After the fact, Uber received backlash for trying to cover up the data leak. Khosrow Shahi issued an open public apology. Gender pay gap. Some of Uber's scandals don't even hide behind closed doors. Comprehensive data from over 1 million drivers and millions of trips taken with Uber revealed that female drivers regularly earn 7% less per hour than male drivers. In the male-dominated world of Silicon Valley, Uber has been at the center of claims of widespread sexual harassment and gender discrimination, a controversy that helped bring down former CEO Travis Kalanick. On the other hand, it would appear that the frat boy culture at Uber has nothing to do with the salary difference. The corporation has a set non-negotiable formula for calculating the cost owed to each driver depending on the distance and duration of each journey. Instead, the disparity results from behavioral variations that may shed light on why inequalities remain in many workplaces despite decades of efforts to reduce them.